Welcome to Same Day, Different Century. I'm Zach. Today is June 22nd. Picture this: Rome, 1633. Inside the convent of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, a great hall fills with the gravity of an occasion. Cardinals are assembled. The machinery of the Holy Inquisition is in motion. And into that room walks an old man. He's 69 years old. His health has been deteriorating for months. He's traveled nearly 200 miles under duress to be here. And today, before God and the Church and history, he is going to kneel on the stone floor and publicly deny what he believed, and what the evidence increasingly pointed toward to be true. His name is Galileo Galilei, and on June 22, 1633, the most celebrated scientist in Europe renounced the idea that the Earth moves around the sun. This is not a simple story. It is not a clean fable about ignorance crushing genius. It is something messier and more human than that. It's about politics, ego, betrayal, and the brutal arithmetic of power in 17th century Europe. Let's go back to the beginning. Nicholas Copernicus had proposed the heliocentric model in 1543, the year he died. For decades, the idea floated in a kind of intellectual limbo. Astronomers used it as a useful mathematical framework. The Church was not immediately alarmed. It was a hypothesis, a model, not yet a declaration of war on Scripture. Then Galileo picked up a telescope. By 1610 to 1611, his observations had become increasingly difficult to reconcile with traditional cosmology. He had discovered 4 moons orbiting Jupiter, the Galilean moons as we still call them. He had observed that Venus moved through phases, just like the moon, which only made sense if Venus was circling the sun. He had seen sunspots on the surface of the sun itself. Everything Galileo saw through that instrument pointed in the same direction, and Galileo, brilliant, combative, constitutionally incapable of suffering fools, was not the kind of man to keep that to himself. The first official collision came in 1616. The Inquisition examined the heliocentric position and declared it philosophically absurd and contrary to Scripture. Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, one of the most powerful theological minds in Rome, met privately with Galileo and issued a formal warning: do not hold or defend the Copernican view. Galileo officially agreed. He would comply, but he didn't stop thinking, and he didn't stop talking. Then, in 1623, something seemed to change in his favor. Maffeo Barberini, a man who had known Galileo for years, who admired his intellect, who had written a poem in his honor, became Pope Urban VIII. Galileo traveled to Rome and met with the new pope multiple times. He came home convinced, or at least hopeful, that the intellectual climate had shifted, that there was now room for a more open conversation. So he wrote a book. The Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems was published in Florence in 1632. In form, it was a conversation among 3 characters: Salviati, who represented the Copernican view, Sagredo, a sharp and curious layman, and Simplicio, the Aristotelian defender of an earth-centered cosmos. Here's where it became politically catastrophic. Pope Urban VIII had given Galileo a specific theological argument to include in the book, an argument that the human mind cannot presume to know the ultimate nature of the universe, that God's omnipotence transcends any scientific model. Galileo put that argument in the mouth of Simplicio. To many readers, the name sounded uncomfortably close to simple-minded, whether Galileo intended that implication or not. The Pope was furious. He felt publicly mocked by a man he had trusted with access and affection. The book was suppressed almost immediately. Galileo was summoned to Rome. There would be no more conversations between old friends. Galileo arrived in the city on February 13, 1633, already ill, having delayed the journey as long as possible with appeals about his health and the plague quarantines then in effect along the roads. He was not thrown into a dungeon. He was housed during the proceedings at the Tuscan ambassador's residence and briefly in rooms within the Holy Office itself. The conditions were relatively comfortable by the standards of an Inquisition trial. The formal hearings began in April. Over multiple depositions, Galileo attempted to argue that the dialogue hadn't genuinely advocated for heliocentrism. They had merely presented arguments on both sides without endorsing either. It was not a convincing defense. The book had a clear Copernican center of gravity, and the judges knew it. There was also a document produced during the trial, a record from 1616 claiming that Cardinal Bellarmine had not merely warned Galileo, but had issued a strict formal injunction never to discuss heliocentrism in any form, under any circumstances. Galileo had his own document from 1616, a certificate from Bellarmine himself, which described only a general warning and made no mention of such an absolute prohibition. The discrepancy between the two records was glaring. Whether the Inquisition's document was authentic, a rough draft that was never formally served, or something else entirely remains a matter of historical debate. What is not debated is that it was used against him. By June, the outcome was not in doubt. On June 22, 1633, Galileo was led before the inquisitors inside the convent of Santa Maria sopra Minerva. He heard his sentence read aloud. The charge was vehement suspicion of heresy, not heresy itself, which is a meaningful legal distinction, but close enough. His sentence included formal imprisonment, subsequently commuted by the inquisitors to house arrest for the remainder of his natural life. Then Galileo knelt, and he recited the abjuration. In it, he swore that he had always believed, did believe, and with God's help would always believe, everything that the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church held, preached, and taught. He declared that he cursed and detested his past errors. He promised to report any heretic who came to his attention. He signed his name to it. There is a legend that after Galileo rose from his knees, he muttered under his breath, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. It is a perfect line. It captures exactly what we want from a man like Galileo in that movement, the inward defiance, the truth that couldn't be unsaid, but historians are deeply skeptical. The earliest known written attribution of the phrase appears more than a century after Galileo's death, in a 1757 publication, over 120 years after the trial. Almost certainly it did not happen. History's most satisfying quotes almost never did. What we know is this: Galileo signed the document, left the hall, and began his sentence. He was first housed at the Villa Medici in Rome, then at the residence of the Archbishop of Siena, and finally permitted to return to his own villa at Arcitri, outside Florence, where he would live under house arrest for the rest of his life. He went completely blind near the end of 1637. During those years of confinement, Galileo composed the discourses and mathematical demonstrations relating to two new sciences: a rigorous mathematical treatment of motion and the strength of materials that many historians regard as his most foundational scientific contribution, the one that would most directly shape Isaac Newton's work. Unable to publish in Italy under the eye of the Inquisition, he had the manuscript smuggled out of the country. It was published in Leyden in the Dutch Republic in 1638. He died on January 8, 1642, still under house arrest. The Vatican's most explicit modern acknowledgement came in 1992, when Pope John Paul II accepted the findings of a commission that concluded church officials had erred in their handling of Galileo, 359 years after the fact. So what does June 22, 1633 mean? It is tempting to read into it as the purest story of institutional power crushing individual truth. The church had the force, Galileo had the evidence, and the church won. But the fuller history is more uncomfortable. Galileo was also a man who had made dangerous enemies through genuine arrogance, who had misjudged the limits of his relationship with the Pope, who had written a book that was, politically, a gift to his opponents. The Church's position was not simply one of willful ignorance. It was tangled up in counter-Reformation politics, in the crisis of scriptural authority, and the social fabric of the era. None of that makes the sentence just. None of that erases what was silenced, what was delayed, what was lost in the gap between truth and its recognition. What Galileo understood, and what no recantation could take from the universe, was the actual shape of the solar system, a picture of reality in which the Earth is not the fixed center of all things, but a small body moving through space, circling a star. He knew it, he signed a paper saying otherwise, and the Earth kept moving anyway. That same day, different century. I'm Zach. We'll be back tomorrow with another date, another story. Thanks for listening.